I've been going through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we worked our way up through chapter 6. And now we're at chapter 7 and following. As we looked at the first part of Ecclesiastes, we're seeing the vanity of things tachat hashamish, of things under the sun. After the introduction of the theme of vanity, we had seen the vanity of human wisdom in chapter 1, the vanity of materialism and pleasure in chapter 2, the vanity of folly in 2 as well, and the vanity of leaving one's inheritance to another, which can be very uncertain. So he says, enjoy life in your toil. And this is a theme that he continues to drive home. He then talks about in chapter 3 how there is a time for everything. And yet, in the midst of that, we are to be enjoying life. And he moves on then to talk about how there's unrighteousness at times in the place where there should be proper justice and judgment. He talks about oppressions under the sun in chapter 4, and then the balance between work and rest. In other words, better to have one hand full of toil and one hand full of rest. He then talked about the vanity of the lonely miser in 4, as well as the vanity of friendship. Uh, how, the value of friendship, how we need friendship in a world that we are living in. We need to have those that we can rely on that are true friends. He then talked about the vanity of popularity, thinking that you were popular and how that's so fleeting. The vanity then, after that, of rash vows follow in chapter 5, and then the oppression of the poor through greediness, which the Kohelet says he sees, and the vanity then of the love of money. Money will not satisfy the love of money because the more you have, the more eaters will come along and eat up what you have. And you can't even enjoy life at times because you're always worried about losing it. And then he talks about the vanity of the wealthy miser. We talked about that in chapter 6. So now we come to chapter 7, in which he's going to talk about how certain things are better than other things. He says a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning, that would be to go to a funeral, than to go to the house of feasting, of a party. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better, he writes. This is all in chapter 7. The heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of a wise man than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity, hevel. Surely oppression makes a wise man mad, and a gift, though, destroys the heart. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning of a thing, and the patient of spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not hasty then in your spirit, he says, to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Say not, what is the cause that the former days were better than these days? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense. But the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to them that have it. This is what we have in the first part of chapter 7, verses 1 to 12. What I'd like to do is now do a brief running commentary through those verses. It seems the thought here is that it is better to have a good name than all the precious oil that one might have, because a good name is something that nothing can ever equal. It is important to have a good reputation, he's saying. He goes on to say that the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. I believe that the reason he is saying this is that if we think of a ship crossing the ocean to another destination, there is more rejoicing when it gets there than when it starts, because it has made it safely across the ocean. I think that is the idea here. The day of death to the Kohelet is better than the day of birth, especially if a life ends well. At birth, one does not know how that life might end. In other words, one might start off at birth and end up later in a very tragic way. So I think, or by doing tragic things. So I think that is the point of the Kohelet that he's making as to why, if one finishes life well, it is more of a time of rejoicing than simply at the birth of a new baby. He goes on then to say, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to heart. Hence it is better to go to a funeral, the Kohelet is saying, than to go to a wedding party. At a funeral, one reflects on the end of life and begins to take life more seriously. It helps a person's character over against simply going to the wedding party and just laughing without seriousness of contemplation. He carries this theme on further then in verse 3, and he says, vexation is better than laughter, for in the sadness of the face the heart may be made glad. In other words, he is reiterating the same idea. Vexation and the pain of it is often better than simply laughing, for in the sadness of the face, it helps the heart to be glad, is the sense that one is turned to a better life by meditating on the meaning of life and going through some hard times that mold a person's character. He goes on to say, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fool is in mirth. This is a continuation of how the mood of reverie and laughter causes one to lead more of a life of recklessness rather than a life that is led by philosophical understanding of the meaning of life. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. It is better to receive a wise person's rebuke than simply the praise of him who is foolish and will not help in a person's improvement. He says, "For the voice of thorns under a pot, so is laughter of fools. This is vanity." There's alliteration here in Hebrew. It's sort of like as the crackling, we could say, of nettles under a kettle might somewhat capture the alliteration of the Hebrew. We can almost hear nettles under a kettle crackling. They are going to be burned up and consumed. That is the way the laughter of a fool is. It is fleeting. "Surely oppression turns a wise man into a fool," he says, "and the gift destroys understanding." If one receives a bribe and accepts that type of thing, it destroys, the Kohelet says, a person's clear thinking and understanding. Often money can bring the destruction to a person's life, especially if it is used in a false way. Better the end of a thing than the beginning of it, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. We're getting a series of proverbs here. We could translate this: better is the end of a word in the Hebrew than the beginning, and the patient of spirit is better than the arrogant or proud. If we say a word and do not know how it will affect someone, it could bring hurt or pain to a person. So it is better to say a word properly and to think about the end result the preacher is saying, than simply respond on the spur of the moment. This fits with the last clause of this verse. It is better to have a spirit that is patient than to have a spirit that is proud and haughty and respond in a rash way with a temper. It is better then to have control of one's emotions, he's saying, and be patient. In verse 9, he continues, "Do not be hasty in your spirit, therefore, to be angry. For anger rests in the bosom of fools." So the exhortation again is to not be quick-tempered. Lead a life of patience rather than hastiness and anger. Do not then say, "How was it?" This is another thought, that it was that the former days were better than these. For it is not out of wisdom that you inquire concerning these things. Some people will say that it was so much better in the good old days of the past than it is today. He who is saying that it is not out of wisdom, the Kohelet is saying, because the past had its problems just like today has. I know it's easy for those of us that are older to think that the past was so much better. But Kohelet is saying, all the way through time, we are seeing that which is evil and that which is good. Wisdom then, he goes on, is good with an inheritance. Yes, a profit to them that see the sun. So wisdom can be very good if it has an inheritance. What does this mean? Possibly the inheritance means if you have wisdom, then you have a financial inheritance, or with a financial inheritance, this can be profit. This is probably what the text is saying. Some imply the inheritance could be something inherited traditionally, such as an idea or a belief, and wisdom is found there. I tend to think he is probably looking at money here in this particular context. It seems, as he goes on, he is simply explaining verse 11 with the following words in verse 12. For wisdom is as a shadow or defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom preserves those who have it. So he concludes in verse 12, wisdom is a defense, even as money, and the one who has the excellency of wisdom has the ability to preserve his life with that wisdom. So it becomes a life preserver, I believe, is what the Kohelet, the preacher, is saying. And as a New Testament, as a Christian minister, I'm thinking of the New Testament, where in Colossians, Christ is seen and said to be the complete wisdom of God. And so, to me, that wisdom is wrapped up in a knowledge of Christ and following him as Lord and Savior and what he has taught us in his teaching as revealed in the Gospels.